Welcome back. Top diplomats from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and several other countries met in Manila over the past few days. On the agenda, a number of regional issues, including efforts to manage tensions in the South China Sea. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Qinduo, I want to start with you this time as well. Let's start with that agreement between the ASEAN nations and China on the framework for a code of conduct in the South China Sea, something meant to diffuse tensions around that issue. How important is this agreement?
Well, this is a very substantial step in terms of in the pursuit of peace and stability. Basically, this is the foundation to work out a set of rules, specific rules, substantive rules that will ensure, that will guide basically the behaviors of regional countries, especially when it comes to South China Sea, and also to guide their cooperation in the future, many decades to come. The purpose is clear, to diffuse potential tensions, potential disputes, to avoid disputes between countries. So this is a very, this has been working basically for 15 years. And after their approval, like 2 months ago in Chinese province of Guizhou, and now it has been approved by the foreign ministers of ASEAN countries and China. So this is a very big step towards this basically long-lasting peace and stability in the region.
Right, Wang Jiangyu, let's listen to what the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had to say about the South China Sea issue. Let's watch.
In the South China Sea, we must resist intervention and be proactive, strengthen long-term planning, create a China-ASEAN strategic partnership of a higher standard, and forge a tighter China-ASEAN community with a shared future.
So, Wang Jiangyu, what do you make of this agreement, and are all ASEAN nations going to be on board?
I tend to agree with the panelists from Beijing that this is a very positive development. At least the parties concerned agreed to negotiate a code of conduct. Of course, one of the most controversial differences between China and some ASEAN countries is whether the code of conduct will create legally binding obligations. The reports suggest that China does not want binding obligations in the code of conduct, but some ASEAN countries, at least some ASEAN countries, including most visibly Vietnam, wants the code of conduct to have binding obligations and to have a dispute settlement mechanism. But all the options are on the table at this stage, as you can hear from the Chinese Prime Minister Wang Yi. We cannot anticipate at this stage what's the content of the code of conduct, because it's going to be negotiated. There is at least the possibility that the code of conduct will contain some substantive obligations that all the parties are to adhere to.
Okay. Sourabh, the ASEAN group, it's an important regional group. What do you see as the major accomplishments of these past few days of meetings?
The major accomplishment has been that they have, by and large, managed to maintain their unity, find a basis for consensus with China, and thereby move forward in a way that will allow the South China Sea to be generally stable, but will not necessarily resolve the issues as such. So it's important to use this as a platform to try to start both get accelerated progress on that framework, which will be a set of rules, and at the same time for China to sit with the ASEAN countries, for the individual ASEAN countries, particularly with the Philippines, when it has such an amenable president, and try to creatively resolve some of those issues which the arbitration highlighted. There are creative ways in which China can come into a certain degree of compliance with that award without admitting it or recognizing it, and that will really take matters onto a very positive track.
Okay, Richard, China is, of course, the economic powerhouse in the region, and it's the second biggest economy in the world as well. How would continued economic growth in China be of benefit to the ASEAN countries, and does that in some way translate into a strategic advantage for China in the region?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why you have the Philippines under President Rodrigo Duterte, and more broadly the ASEAN region, trying to find an understanding or working agreement on the South China Sea issue is precisely because they want to focus on areas of cooperation and common interest. So you see this very concerted effort by the Philippine government, for instance, as the chairman of the ASEAN, to say that, well, the South China Sea is an intractable issue. Maybe for now, let's just look at certain modus vivendi to just manage it. A resolution of that is something that we cannot achieve in the short run. What we can focus on is how to benefit economically from China. And of course, China's Belt and Road Initiative, China's Asian Development Bank Initiative, all of these kinds of different free trade agreements like the RCEP and Free Trade Area for the Asia Pacific that China is either supporting or independently pushing forward. All of these things are now dominating the discussions here in ASEAN. Yesterday, President Duterte gave a speech celebrating the ASEAN 50th anniversary, and he talked about the importance of fighting against protectionism, of pushing for free trade agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which for me kind of echoed the statements that President Xi Jinping made in the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year. So you have both ASEAN and China right now essentially as the guardians of globalization and a liberal economic international order, just as we see anti-trade protectionist tendencies gaining ground in the United States and certain Western countries. So this is a very interesting development. Now, in 2 decades from now, ASEAN is expected to become a significant economic bloc, perhaps the 4th largest in the world. But ASEAN knows that they have to get certain things in order, and that is infrastructure. There's a huge infrastructure need here in Southeast Asia. Countries like the Philippines need $11 billion every year to get their basic infrastructure question in line. And Chinese capital and Chinese investment is, of course, very important. And that is why, of course, a lot of ASEAN countries are also carefully watching if China can also sustain its economic growth and deal with internal economic imbalances, including the big debt that is building up in the Chinese economy. And of course, down the road, there's an expectation that as China moves from an export-oriented economy to a consumer-based economy, the Chinese industrial power concentrated in the Pearl River Delta will be expanded across the ASEAN region. So we are also expecting the Chinese to also be a source of manufacturing investment, not only a source of infrastructure investment, as the ASEAN moves up the ladder of production and supply.
Wang Jiangyu, Richard mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative there that China has launched. And if we look at as that initiative develops in Southeast Asia, to what extent will it contribute to building trust between China and other countries in the region?
Yeah, back to your first question to Richard, if I can add something here. Well, not only ASEAN countries have benefited tremendously from the Chinese economic development. China is certainly now the largest market for almost all the ASEAN countries. So ASEAN countries have harvested huge, tremendous economic benefit from the Chinese market. But economic relations are a kind of a two-way channel. The ASEAN is already one of the world's largest markets, as mentioned by one of the panelists, ASEAN is going to become the world's 4th largest market. So China will also depend on the ASEAN market in the future. So the economic interdependence is mutual. So and economic relations between China and ASEAN not only works to China's advantage, but also works to ASEAN's advantage. But speaking of the One Belt, One Road, because the One Belt, One Road project or the initiative will export Chinese capital and the Chinese technology and the Chinese know-how, especially on infrastructure building, that's something very much wanted by ASEAN countries. But there are also some problems because the ASEAN countries, because the ASEAN is not yet a European Union-like community, right? So their concern, their worry is that in expanding its One Belt, One Road initiative in ASEAN countries, China might apply a divide and conquer strategy, and so to delay the formation of eventually a community in ASEAN.
Jiangyu, we have to go. Sorry to get in your way like that, but we've run out of time. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.